Before Lagos became a city of gold, before the miracles, the mansions, and the madness, there was a prophecy. A blessing that came wrapped in light and sealed in blood. This is the story of a pastor, a city, and the hidden price of divine favor. Subscribe now and enter the fire. Because not all miracles are from God, and some blessings are buried with screams. The first miracle wasn't the wealth that came, it was how easily they forgot who they were before it. Before the towers rose like silver swords against the Lagos skyline, before the private jets hummed over Makoko's forgotten rooftops, before the news cameras arrived to film what they called the City of Divine Ascent, there was silence, a sacred, aching silence, and a prophecy whispered like thunder through the throat of a humble man. They called him Pastor Ezra, not because he wore Gucci suits or had a YouTube channel like the others, not because his church had chandeliers or an LED cross that changed colors during worship, but because his voice held weight, a kind of ancient weight, like the words came from somewhere deeper than his lungs, from the very soil that bore Lagos itself. He was never loud, he never begged, but when he spoke, the ground beneath the church's zinc roof seemed to tremble. They said God spoke through him. And one Sunday, a hot, golden afternoon where the scent of roadside puff-puff mingled with diesel fumes and Sunday perfume, Pastor Ezra stood before the weary congregation of New Fire Assembly and uttered 7 words that would rewrite the city's soul. Wealth is coming, but it will cost. No one heard the second half. Not really, because by the end of that same week, a tech deal sealed by one of the church's young ushers went viral. An app, a simple utility platform for electricity vending, was acquired by a European firm for $46 million. By the next week, 2 more members announced miraculous financial breakthroughs. Debt canceled, lands reclaimed, bank accounts revived like Lazarus. The world called it the Ajigunal Awakening. What was once a forgotten district, riddled with potholes, roadside mechanics, and rusted shipping containers, was now the epicenter of what Forbes called Africa's Silicon Spirit Surge. Luxury condos sprung up like mushrooms after rain. The main church expanded into a marble cathedral with gold-plated gates, complete with biometric access and underground parking. Pastor Ezra refused to move into the parsonage. He kept his small flat in a faded Lekki block, his car still the battered Corolla he had driven since the 2000s. But everything else around him changed. The young people in the church stopped dreaming of visas. They began dreaming of angel investors. The women who once wore second-hand Ankara now arrived in head-to-toe designer fits. Versace head wraps, Balenciaga heels. The men traded their Okadas for Teslas and Range Rovers, delivered in crates from Apapa port. But what they didn't notice was how the laughter changed. At first, it rang through the streets, wild, hopeful, healing. But slowly, like a candle drowning in its own wax, the joy turned shallow. Polished smiles, careful chuckles, paranoia hiding behind every designer lens. They said it was the price of success. They said growth was never comfortable. But some, mostly the elders, began to whisper. It started with Ngozi, the florist who was the first to tie the ₦1,000,000 in cash. One night, after an exclusive rooftop wedding in Ikoyi, she was found dead in her Bentley. Her heart stopped while her favorite worship song was still playing. No autopsy revealed foul play. The doctors said undiagnosed cardiac event. But she was 29. Then came Uche, who opened a chain of digital banks across Africa after Ezra laid hands on him. He was kidnapped on 3rd Mainland Bridge. Never found. The police claimed his GPS malfunctioned. One by one, the early receivers of the prophecy's wealth began to vanish. Accidents, heart attacks, sudden disappearances. No pattern, except that they were all among the first blessed. The city's wealth doubled, then tripled. But the air grew heavy, like Lagos was holding its breath. Still, New Fire Assembly flourished. They added a second cathedral in Abuja. A media wing was opened, Fire TV, which broadcast 24/7 worship and teachings across the continent. But Pastor Ezra grew thinner. Not sick, just fading. He preached with less fire, walked slower, smiled less. Yet he never spoke of the deaths, never condemned the wealth, and never, ever repeated the prophecy. Those closest to him began to wonder if he regretted it. But in Lagos, questions are luxuries. There are school fees, generators, business grants, family in the village. So they danced, they sang, they gave, and they forgot. Until Kemi. She was the final sign. She was the golden daughter of the church, a poet, software developer, and philanthropist. Kemi had grown up under Ezra's shadow, her family among the first converts. She was brilliant, kind, and untouched by scandal. When her startup, a mobile education app for rural girls, was valued at $110 million, they held a Thanksgiving service like none other. Helicopters hovered. Senators came. The president sent a personal message. They called it a celebration of God's promise fulfilled. But that night, Kemi crashed her Tesla on a road with no other cars. The footage, leaked later, showed something chilling. The car didn't malfunction. It swerved violently on an empty road, as if something invisible had entered it. She died before dawn. And that's when the murmurs became thunder. Had Ezra called a curse not a blessing? The question spread like harmattan fire through WhatsApp groups and Sunday brunch tables. Was this truly divine favor? Or had something ancient, something dark, been awakened by the pastor's words? And more importantly, if the wealth had a price, who was next to pay? As the city turned sleepless and the sun rose over gold-plated rooftops, Pastor Ezra sat alone in his apartment, watching a flame flicker in a clay lamp. His fingers trembled as he reached into a drawer and pulled out a letter, one written years before the prophecy. It was addressed not to a person, but to a spirit. And as he read the first line, the words burned across the paper, revealing something no one had seen. The covenant is sealed, and the clock has begun. Wealth that is not rooted in peace always drips with an invisible red. There are certain roads in Lagos that never forget. No matter how many times they are patched, paved, renamed, or covered with glass towers and security gates, they remember the feet that once walked barefoot on them. The screams of mothers when soldiers came. The quiet prayers whispered into the cracks of broken cement. Pastor Ezra lived on one such road. Not in the shining parts of Lekki Phase 1, but in the in-between. Not quite slum, not quite safe. His apartment was high enough to hear the sirens but low enough to smell the smoke from street suya. And that night, after Kemi's body was lowered into marble tombs and media voices moved on, Ezra sat in silence. The letter before him was old. The paper yellowed, the ink faded. But the words still pulsed. The covenant is sealed, and the clock has begun. Ezra had written those words in 1997, not as a pastor, not as a prophet, but as a desperate young man trying to save a dying father. Back then he was just Ezra Kalu, a university dropout working as a library janitor at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. His father, a widowed herbalist, was rotting from the inside, afflicted by an illness the hospitals had no name for. He watched his body collapse like a clay pot in slow motion. And so, Ezra did what the sons of ancient lands sometimes do when the hospitals fail. He went into the forest, not for medicine, but for audience. Deep within the Nsukka hills, beyond the buried shrines and abandoned covens, he found a voice. Or rather, it found him. The name was never spoken, only felt. A warmth that became cold. A whisper that sounded like thunder. It offered him a trade. Speak what I give you and they will listen. But in every gain there shall be loss. He agreed, wrote it down, sealed it with blood. And the next day his father walked again. By the end of that month, Ezra was preaching in street corners, his voice drawing crowds like honey draws flies. He didn't plan to build a church. He simply followed the fire, until it led him to Lagos, to Ajagunle, to New Fire Assembly, to the prophecy. Now, nearly 3 decades later, the covenant's clause had begun to surface. Ezra closed the letter and stood by the window, watching the city pulse beneath him. Cars like blood cells rushing through steel veins, music thumping from rooftop bars, the glow of prosperity wrapping Lagos like a masquerade's cloth. But he saw what others couldn't. He saw the cracks beneath the gold, the dreams turning to nightmares, the wealth that came with no laughter. The city was beautiful, but hollow, and somewhere beneath its foundations, something ancient was feeding. Across town, Toby Adeoye, the assistant general overseer of New Fire Assembly, was staring at a different kind of letter. This one had no blood, just numbers, big ones. He sat in his Banana Island apartment, surrounded by clean glass, chilled air, and silence thick as regret. His suit was untouched, tailored from Milan. His shoes could pay a graduate's rent. But his hands shook as he scanned the numbers again. It was the church's financial audit. And buried deep within the final page, a transfer, 78 million Nigerian nairas, to a private offshore account, from an internal sub-account labeled Legacy Fund, Ezra Kalu. But Pastor Ezra had never approved such a fund. He hated excess. He refused salary. He still cooked his own stew. Toby felt his heart squeeze. He'd always believed in the prophecy. But this This felt wrong. He had been loyal. Through the deaths, the doubts, the scandals whispered in prayer groups and buried under testimonies. But now a new thought entered him. One that felt like betrayal, but also freedom. What if the prophecy wasn't from God? What if this fire they had followed was something else? He picked up his phone, dialed, let it ring. Hello? Ezra's voice came low and tired. We need to talk, Toby said. There was silence. Then, I know. In the weeks that followed Kemi's death, Lagos began to unravel in subtle, spiritual ways. Rain fell where there was no cloud. Children spoke in tongues in their sleep. Dogs refused to bark at night. A drone filming content for Fire TV crashed suddenly, its last footage showing a black figure in the reflection of the church glass, a figure no one had seen in the crowd. And more deaths followed. Bola, the church's choir leader, collapsed during rehearsal. Chika, the architect who designed the marble cathedral, drowned in his own swimming pool despite being a strong swimmer. Each one had given. Each one had received. Each one had paid. When Ezra met Toby, it was not in the cathedral, but in an abandoned estate once meant for pastors' housing, a failed project choked by litigation and weeds. They stood in the silence of the half-built halls, marble floors now cracked with dust, paint peeling like snake skin. Toby held the financial document. Ezra held nothing. You created the fund? Toby asked, voice shaking. Ezra did not answer. Instead, he stepped toward a wall and placed his hand on it. This place was never meant to be built, he whispered, because I never asked for this kingdom. It was given with terms. Toby's eyes burned. So it's true? It's all blood money? Ezra turned slowly. No, the money is real. The blessings are real. Then why are we dying? Ezra exhaled. Because we only remembered the first half of the prophecy. Wealth is coming. But no one prepared for the price. Toby stepped back. You made a deal. With what? Ezra's eyes glistened. With something older than scripture. Something that lives between the lines of faith and desperation. I didn't summon it. I asked, and it answered. The silence that followed was heavier than concrete. And then a sudden crash. A door in the estate slammed open. Wind, no, something colder rushed in. Both men turned. And in the broken glass of the estate window they saw it. A shape. Not a man. Not a shadow. But a presence. Tall. Silent. Grinning without a mouth. The same figure seen in the drone footage. It had come. And in its hand, if that claw could be called a hand, was a scroll. Sealed with Ezra's blood. Toby stepped back in terror. What is that? Ezra closed his eyes. The second half. The scroll unrolled in the air. Invisible ink began to burn into legibility. And written across it in fire was a single terrifying line. Only one of you can break the covenant. Some covenants do not break with prayers. Only with blood. And choice. The sky over Lagos cracked at dawn, not with thunder but with knowing. That heavy silence just before a city realizes its soul has been bought. And now the receipt had come due. The figure that stood before Pastor Ezra and Toby was not of this world. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It simply was. A darkness shaped like memory. A form made from every whispered deal, every desperate vow made in secret places. Every prayer that began with, God if you just. And ended with compromise. And in its claw that fireborn scroll still floated. Its single sentence shimmering like a verdict. Only one of you can break the covenant. Ezra dropped to his knees. Toby stood frozen, his body stiff like iron, his mind unraveling with quiet screams. For a moment the figure did nothing. Then it turned. Not with legs, just a shift of energy toward Ezra. And the room, the air, the very city itself held its breath. Toby didn't remember how they got back to Ezra's apartment. Only that the figure had vanished. And something had been left behind in its place. A feeling. Like a countdown. Like a storm beneath the skin of the world. Ezra sat quietly now, back at his familiar window, watching the Lagos skyline throb with light and oblivion. This is my doing, he said softly. Toby wanted to scream, to accuse, to ask how a man of God could have invited darkness into the lives of so many. But instead he said, then fix it. Ezra turned, eyes hollow. There's only one way. The covenant was never alone. It was a trade. And the debt had grown. With every mansion, every miracle, every church expansion, every camera, every offering placed in trust and faith, the price had risen. And now, only death could break it. But not just any death. A willing death. One given in surrender, not accident. One pure. One full. One in the open, not hidden like the sin that created the covenant. Ezra knew. It had to be him. By Sunday morning, the sky above Lagos was the color of rusted brass. Strange clouds gathered over the city, low, swirling, like spirits waiting for permission. But the streets were full, because New Fire Assembly had announced one final service. One final word from Pastor Ezra. Toby watched from the pulpit, heart cracking with every second. He had begged him not to do it. But Ezra only smiled. "I planted the seed," he had said. "Now let me bury it." The cathedral was packed. Even the overflow tents were bursting. Live streams rolled across Africa. The president's wife was in attendance. And Ezra stepped to the podium, not in robes, not in gold, but in white, plain white, the kind worn by farmers, by mourners, by lambs. And with a voice that shook heaven and earth, he spoke. "My children," he began, his words calm as ocean tide. "I gave you fire, but I did not tell you that it would burn. I prophesied your rising, but I did not warn you of the cost. I spoke what I believed was God, but it was my desperation that answered." There were gasps, whispers. A few walked out. "Yes," Ezra continued, "you were blessed. But not all blessings are divine. Some are borrowed. And everything borrowed must be returned." He paused, then looked out into the sea of faces. Some tear-streaked, some hard, all waiting. "I made a covenant, and I am the only one who can break it." There was movement, ushers rising, security tensing. But Ezra raised a hand, and everyone stilled. "Tonight," he said, "the blood required will be given." And with that he stepped down from the pulpit, walked past Toby and into the night. The next morning his body was found at the old estate, the same place where the spirit had appeared. No wound, no violence, just a peaceful, slumped body, hands folded, eyes closed, like a man who had finally exhaled after a lifetime of holding breath. Beside him was the original letter, the covenant, now burned clean, only ash remaining. And next to that, a new scroll. This one was for Toby. His words simple. "The fire is yours now, but guide it with truth." Lagos didn't change overnight. There was no firestorm, no angels singing above Third Mainland Bridge. But slowly, the death stopped. The sky cleared. The laughter returned, hesitant then wild. The wealth didn't vanish, but it lost its poison. Those who had hoarded began to give. Those who had envied began to share. And New Fire Assembly reopened, not with marble, not with chandeliers, but as a small church again. Just enough space, just enough light. Toby preached, not with Ezra's thunder, but with something deeper. Humility. Years passed. The city forgot the deaths as cities do. But Ezra's name became legend. A cautionary tale. A whispered prayer. A reminder. And every year on the day he died, the sun would rise red over Lagos, as if the city remembered too. Moral. When you make fire your god, prepare to be consumed. But if you walk with fire as your servant, light can still come without ashes.